Thank you, Mr. Favarini-Chorba. Before we barrage you with questions, we're going to ask Ms. Hannock to give her presentation. Welcome.
Thank you very much. So before you've got a couple of handouts. One looks like a PowerPoint presentation. I'm not going to show you slides, but that'd be easy to walk through because I have some figures to show you. And then there's also an op-ed that I want to mention at the end of my comments. So what I'm going to be talking to you about a little bit today is an overview of the state's role in water system funding, and this is drawing largely on a study that I worked on with a large number of co-authors that came out in the spring of last year. I think the numbers are still pretty valid. So just to kind of kick off, because we've been talking a lot about bonds, and that's a very important part of the state's role in water system funding, the first figure on slide 2 shows you just over time the role that state geo bonds for water have, how they've progressed. And what you can see is this big spike in the 2000s. That was 6 bonds that voters approved between 2000 and 2006. Most of those were put on the ballot by initiative, but there was one, Prop 1E, that was put on by the legislature for floods. And you know, these are now to compare apples with apples. They're all put in 2012 dollars. So the nominal value of the bonds passed in the 2000s was almost 20 billion. Then we just had the passage of Prop 1 in November after having been postponed for a number of times. So it's looking like, you know, we're maybe the 2000s were kind of the really big burst in terms of bond funding, but clearly the new money that's approved gives the state some additional ability to be leveraging its funding in important ways. Now, just to turn to the next slide on page 3, just wanted you to see sort of how the annual spending has been going since this big infusion of bond funds. And the brown solid line there is overall spending from these bonds, and then the blue dotted line is spending specifically related to the water sector, because some of the early bonds in the 2000s also had a significant chunk of funding for parks, and that was acquisition of land in particular. So the dotted blue shows you that it's rare to get over $1 billion spent in a year in the water sector. And I think if you look at the LAO report and the governor, the administration's proposal on how it's going to spend Prop 1, it's about that. There's not an attempt to be overly ambitious in getting funds out the door. So that's probably realistic, I think. But then another line I want you to see there and draw attention to is the orange one that's creeping up over time, and that has now crossed the brown line. That is the repayment, the debt service repayment on these bonds. And so it's useful, I think, as a reminder that we do ultimately have to pay these back, and that's sort of something that one should consider in the overall budget context for the state. Now, bonds are very important, clearly can make a lot of good things happen, and we found as we were looking at where the bonds were spent up till now that they definitely went to a lot of areas in need. But I'd like you now to look at slide 4, which helps kind of provide put that a little bit into context of how much money we're actually spending on water in the state and where that's coming from. Overall in California, you know, so we've been spending about $1 billion, maybe less than that a year from bonds, from state bonds. Overall, we're spending over $30 billion a year in our water system. And so this graph here on slide 4 breaks it down for you in some broad kind of categories of types of different parts of the water system. The biggest bar overall is for water supply, and that's mostly urban water systems. Agriculture is in there too, but those are less costly systems because they don't have the same treatment and underground plumbing facilities and so on. Then you've got water quality. That's the next biggest one. That's mostly wastewater. It includes a bit of stormwater spending too. Much smaller bar is flood management, and then aquatic ecosystems. In there, aquatic ecosystems is really just including the state and federal Fish and Wildlife Agency spending, not the money that gets spent in the context of water supply or flood projects. And then I just for good measure, put in there the geo debt service, just to remind us that is related to the water system too. Now the color coding is also important and useful to focus on. The orange, which is by far the biggest in those first 3 bars, is locally sourced funding. And so what that is mostly people's water bills, people's sewer bills, and in the case of flood management, it's local taxes and assessments to a large extent. 84% overall of water spending is raised locally from bills and from assessments and from taxes. And so while the state is certainly important, coming in with about 12%, it's a marginal player in the overall piece. And that means that where the state spends its money is really, you have to view it as sort of how to leverage and where to kind of come in with filling the gaps that the locals can't fill themselves, or kind of helping to encourage locals to do things that the state would like them to do by providing matching funds. And that's been a big part of how bonds have been used as a sort of match to nudge local agencies along. The other very small sliver, it's hard to even see on this graph, is the light blue. That's the federal share, 4%. And that's probably high relative to what we're going to be looking at in this decade, because that included some Recovery Act stimulus spending, which was a big boost in the late 2000s. So we can certainly always be happy to get money from the federal government when you can get it. That's great. But, and I always recommend when I'm talking to local agencies, go for it if you can. But we can't count on that as the big pot of money that people sometimes have hoped. Now, given that local spending is such an important part of the overall water system, I think that it's important for the legislature to also think not just about how to provide oversight on bond spending and general fund monies that are allocated, but also how it can play a role in helping locals to raise funding. And so that's where I want you to just take a quick look at slide 5, which provides an overview of some of the constitutional changes that have happened in California, approved by voters in 3 different propositions in 1978, 96, and 2010, that have made it harder for locals to raise funding. And I'm just going to not go through everything here, but just kind of highlight a few of the key things that it's important to keep in mind as you think about as you're thinking about how to help the locals do their job better. So the first one, Prop 13, of course, it's famous for the change in the property tax. That did change local water funding a lot because a lot of agencies used to use property tax revenues to fund their infrastructure, shifted that over more to water bills and wastewater bills. But the key thing that I want to highlight for you is the part in red there. It created a category of taxes called special taxes, and it said that those require a 2/3 vote. So 1996 comes along, and Prop 218 is passed, and then that local special tax restriction really becomes very important, because that Prop 218 says that general taxes are not available any longer to special districts. And as you know, most water agencies are special districts at the local level. So what that means is, by definition, even a multi-purpose special district, say like the Santa Clara Valley Water Agency, which has flood protection, watershed protection, and water supply, any tax that they would put on the ballot would have to be a special tax. It's important because 2/3 is a high hurdle. And as one of the members, as you pointed out, the Prop 1 passed by a large majority. Two out of 3 voters passed it. At the local level, that would have just squeaked by. And we think at the state level, that's a big deal. So it's really hard to raise taxes at the local level with the special 2/3 voter approval required. Now, the other important thing that happened with Prop 218 was that Prop 218 created a category of local fees and assessments called property-related fees and assessments. And court interpretations have clarified this over time, basically saying pretty much anything water-related that relates to service to a customer on a property. So that's your water supply, your sewer systems, your flood protection, even some stormwater-related things are property-related fees. And there was an accountability idea in mind behind Prop 218, the idea that of wanting the cost to be related to the services that were delivered, and wanting agencies to be accountable. And that was a really good intention, and I think that parts of Prop 218 have been very helpful in that way, requiring notice. Whenever your water or wastewater bill is going to get raised, you get a notice in the mail telling you that this is going to happen, requiring a hearing. But what it also introduced were some things that have turned out to be kind of, in some ways, too simplistic, and making agencies have to kind of jump through hurdles to show that the costs on the bills are specifically tied to the services being delivered. And in some cases, they have to even jump through a hurdle of specifically delivering that drop of water to that property in order for it to be considered legitimate in court challenges. And so it's turned out to be harder to pass some of the fees related to what we call integrated water management, or sort of where you're trying to get multiple benefits out of a project. It's hard to do that now. And for floods and stormwater, in addition to that difficulty about specific cost of service definition, you also, in addition to having a hearing about the rate increases, you have to affirmatively get voter approval, at least half of property owners or 2/3 of the public. And that turns out to be a much higher hurdle than just not having too many people protest. People affirmatively voting to raise fees is harder. So you're going to see a big problem for those agencies. Now, Prop 210 kind of basically added to this kind of these kinds of requirements for non-property related fees, and that can be an issue for stormwater. So turning to slide 6, you're going to see that these changes made a big difference for the kinds of water services that are really in trouble. And what we did was we looked across the whole spectrum of the different kinds of services, and we kind of gave passing or failing grades. What we found was that local water and wastewater is actually in pretty good shape, because although Prop 218 provides some difficulties for them, they've pretty much been able to raise bills and do the capital spending they need to when they need to. Doesn't mean everything is great, but it's in pretty good shape if you compare it with measures of needs. But we have failing marks in some areas, and these are areas that we've kind of started to call fiscal orphans. So the first one that you've heard a lot about over the last couple of years is safe drinking water, especially in small rural communities. And that's an affordability issue, as well as a high cost per household issue, because these are small systems that just don't have scale economies. There's a measure there of, the annual gap. It's not huge in statewide scale to provide help to those communities, but they can't do it themselves. The second is flood protection, where there's a huge gap, and this is using DWR and the Army Corps numbers on the amount of investment gap Anton mentioned for the Central Valley, 14 to 17 billion. Statewide, we're probably looking at about a $34 billion capital need, and we're just way behind on that. Stormwater management, way behind again, failing. This is something that really has gotten hit by Prop 218, because stormwater used to just be about getting water, draining streets, sort of the baby floods. And now it's also about preventing pollution. And that came in after 218 mainly is when cities and counties have had to do this, and it's very hard to go to voters and say, raise money, pay taxes so that we are not polluting somebody downstream. Because it's very much less about your own community than it is about downstream. Aquatic ecosystems also failing in relation to what we need to be spending. And I'll just remind you here that our fish and a lot of the wildlife that depend on our aquatic ecosystems are not doing so well. So another big gap there. And there it's really a question of who's responsible, because a lot of this is legacy actions. And then finally, integrated management, integrated water management, which is where the state has come in with bond money to kind of help nudge local agencies along for getting them to cooperate in ways that they're not used to. So you add all this up, we're talking about $2 to $3 billion a year of gap, which is not huge compared to the 30+ billion we're spending, but these are areas where it's very hard to raise the funds locally. So turning to slide 7, we provide some suggestions, more detailed in the report, about where we need to go beyond bonds, but we thought it'd be useful just to sort of compare the gap now with what's in Prop 1. So that this shows you sort of side by side the annual gap that we estimate and the one-time infusion from Prop 1. And what you can see is that the Proposition 1 is definitely aimed to address a lot of these orphan areas, but it's not going to fill the gap for any long period of time. So we also need to be looking for other sources of funding. I think that's very consistent with what the LAO has suggested, say, in relation to floods, for example, as a way of addressing gaps. So we look at a variety of different types of fees and taxes at the state and local level that could be passed. As long as the Constitution stays where it is, the state is going to have to do more than locals are, and locals can't do as much because of the 2/3 hurdle. Now, slide 8, just to sort of get to where the legislature can help, I think. Beyond bonds, I think it's very important to think about how to leverage the bonds well, first of all, and really kind of get the best bang for the buck, since the bonds are a marginal source, I think that the legislature can do some other things really effectively. One of them, and there's been some progress on this last year, one of them is extending broader funding authorities to local agencies. I think the Groundwater Sustainability Management Act did that for groundwater agencies by giving them, kind of clarifying their fee authorities at the local level. A second one is guiding the courts on how to interpret water management costs. And this is where, the legislature cannot supplant the Constitution on these issues, but can provide interpretation that courts can use as valuable information in thinking about these cases that get brought to them. And I think that AB 2403 that was passed and enacted last year was a good example of that. That was one that basically codified into law a court ruling in the Pajaro Valley that said that groundwater management agencies that wanted to use recycled water or stormwater capture to benefit the basin, that is a water service. And that means it doesn't have to go for a vote. It's considered a water service just like water that comes out of your tap. A third area is thinking about the safe drinking water in small rural communities. Clearly consolidation, either physical or management consolidation is going to be really important for these agencies. And the state taking on liability for some of the legacy contaminants there is probably an important thing to think about. And then I've added, I couldn't help myself, pass some new fees and taxes. I wish that the bond that had gone to voters had included also some new fees or taxes to provide a reliable source of funding. A lot of other states have that. Other countries like Australia have that. And I think that can be a useful way of providing reliability. And then I just wanted to end with a couple comments on drought resilience and the drought spending that you're going to be looking at now. On slide 9, building drought resilience, there's been a lot of really great work that's been done in this drought emergency, and the funds have been devoted to supporting affected communities, affected ecosystems, a lot of local water supply efficiency, water demand efficiency and diversification efforts. All of that's been really useful. I think that the drought has also exposed a couple of really critical weaknesses in our system, and this is going to echo what Anton says, and we did not plan this. I was happy to hear what he had to say. One of them is in the state information systems. When water is really tight, having the information that we need to fairly and transparently allocate the water that we do have, we need better information. And that includes, providing more funds for using the technologies like stream gauges and modeling and remote sensing and so on to do this, but it also includes requiring more reporting. And so the legislature in 2009 required for the first time regular every 3-year reporting of some of the more senior pre-1914 water rights and riparian rights. That's been very useful to the state board actually in managing the scarcity. Getting to every year is going to be a better thing, but also thinking about requiring reporting of discharges is going to be important, because discharges, what gets, runs back off the system from a wastewater plant or from fields is actually a really important part of the total water supply in some systems, and we need to know that. The second area is in thinking about managing ecosystems during droughts, and the Fish and Wildlife Service department has just been really doing an incredible job in trying to manage as best they can various ecosystems across the state in trouble, but we don't have a sort of advanced planning system in the way that we really should on the ecosystem to kind of know what are our priorities when we're going into a drought, how do we allocate scarce water, how do we sort of think about getting the most pop per drop. And we think that this is an area where we need to do not just emergency room care, but also really thinking about what's our plan and setting up a task force to really decide what this should be. This is something the Australians did during their drought, so it's not something we need to wait until after the drought for. We think that this is worth doing now, because we don't know how long this drought's going to last. So with that, I will stop talking. Thank you.
Terrific presentation. Thank you, Ms. Hannock. Our new mantra is going to be greatest pop per drop. That's very good.
I have to give credit to Josh Veers from UC Merced for inventing that.
So credited, so credited. So I'm sure most of the committee, I'm taking names as I speak, will have questions. I will start off with a couple, first on drought and then second on flood protection, Prop 1E, and this would be for either or both of you. With regard to drought, this governor and administration have been unequivocal in their recognition of and need to address climate change. It's a top priority for the governor. I haven't read any reports, projections, or news accounts that anyone suggests we're going to have greater snowpack as a result of climate change. In fact, quite the opposite. I think we're all quite well aware that if California is heating up, which it seems to be doing on a regular and annual basis, and even when we have our rains, they are warmer rains and we're getting ever less snow. Should we be reconsidering, revisiting our approach to what has been our historic water system, which depends upon massive snow amounts that will slowly melt over the spring into our system? Should we be thinking much more significantly in that direction?
I'll start and then pass the mic to Anton. So
And just to complete that, and that sort of also dovetails into your comments with regard to we should not be managing drought as an emergency. It's with us to stay.
Agreed. So I think, there's still a lot of uncertainty about the exact time path of temperature increases, but one of the areas that the models kind of all converge on in looking at our climate is that it's already getting warmer, it's going to be getting warmer, and that's going to be shrinking our snowpack. It's just a question of how fast. We don't know with the same amount of reliability whether we're going to get more or less rain. But there's an expectation we're going to get more variable rain or precipitation too. So if you think about those factors in relation to our existing storage and conveyance system, what it means is that our surface reservoirs are going to be taxed definitely more than they are now, because they have to provide flood protection in addition to storing water for the summer, as well as storing some water for dry years. That observation has led a lot of folks to say, well, automatically we need to build more surface reservoirs. And that's definitely a piece of the answer, but I would say it's not the only answer, because what we can also think about is how we use our existing plumbing to also get more water under the ground. And if you look at how agriculture got through this past year, definitely it was hurt, but much less hurt than if it didn't have access to groundwater. The UC Davis estimates that about 5 million of the 6.5 million acre feet of surface water that was lost was replaced with extra groundwater pumping. So we've got these big storage underground too, and I think that the groundwater Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, SGMA, right? That the new act helps to create conditions that are going to favor us also getting more water under the ground. And there's modeling that shows that if you reoperate the surface reservoirs so that you're getting the dry year storage out of those and into the ground, you can use the existing storage reservoirs more effectively also. But in order to get that water under the ground, you've got to put it in places where people feel confident that they're going to be able to get it out again, and that if it's there dropped and they're going to get it out. So that's where the groundwater management comes in. And there has already been a lot of effective groundwater banking. So we have models for how to do this, but we could do more of it.
And just a couple of comments. I think to add to what Ellen is saying, one of the strengths of surface storage is that it's good for capturing large, quick flows. And groundwater, it takes a little bit of time for it to actually sink and percolate into the system. So as Ellen's talking about, using each of those for their strengths, I think will be important and may involve some looking at how we operate the system. I'll actually tie your question also to flood control, partly as Ellen did, because we'll also have to think about how we manage floods and whether our system is resilient to floods if we do start getting larger pulses of precipitation. Some of the strategies that have been suggested for that are additional flood bypasses, like the YOLO bypass, or other sorts of systems. So there are some options there.